were there any questions to start after the break? So as you can see from the title of Philosophy and Theology, so we're going to extend a little bit into some contemporary philosophical thought, although St. Thomas Aquinas is not quite contemporary, unless there's some weird stuff happening that I don't know about. But he does extend or is really the recovery of the Aristotelian tradition and Aristotle's thought into the church. Aristotle disappears from Western thought from approximately 400, mid-400s to 12, to really until St. Thomas is writing. It's his conversations with Muslim philosophers during medieval time, that during his life, that Aristotle recovered. And his work is sort of a synthesis of Augustinian tradition and Aristotle, and sort of, as some would say, the improvement upon the Augustinian tradition. I know Dr. Waters would respectfully disagree with that, or not so respectfully, but certainly disagree with that. But it is a combination. He inherits from both. And you can see citations from both of them throughout his work. And the significance of Aristotle can't really be understated in his work, simply referring to him as the philosopher. And so it really dispenses with Plato, to whom Augustine is much indebted. And so it really is a synthesis, and how successful it is or not is up for other people. But I want to highlight to him, partially because he does completely adopt the natural excellences or virtues on the lines of Aristotelian thought, or Aristotle, to the point that parts of his citations will say the philosopher says this, and this as a reply to his objections, the objections of other schools of thought. So it is the same. He holds to the doctrine of means. He holds to that we are, that humans have a natural telos. The telos, however, is love for God. And so we see that Thomas has need to think a little bit further than Aristotle. So he assumes the natural excellence and the virtues. So what we said about Aristotle, we can largely say about St. Thomas's understanding of the virtues and how they are acquired. It is by nature that we can either acquire virtue or vice, so on and so forth. So we'll skip to what Aristotle does not talk about, and what is of significant importance for St. Thomas is in the church, after all. And that is the connatural virtues, the theological virtues, and connatural excellence. And so, what do you do when your theological position, the theological inheritance, suggests that we are sinners and that we are made for fellowship with God, but that has been ruptured? And that fellowship for God is fellowship with God is our telos. Well, he doesn't really deviate so much from this idea that there are virtues. And he posits the idea that the theological virtues are given to us, they're infused to us by God. And so it is they don't violate our nature, right? They are connatural. They are in fact our higher nature. So we have these natural excellences. We think of the cardinal virtues and the other virtues, but the cardinal virtues in particular, with temperance and wisdom and courage and justice. And if these are the four cardinal virtues, these are the things that humanity needs to exist qua humanity. That if we are going to have a properly functioning society, these are the virtues that each human person needs to have. And again, we're still existing within a hierarchical structure. There's no question about that. If we need these things, but these only get us at what it is that human society needs, and this doesn't get us at our true telos, which is fellowship with God. And so God, through charity, through love, infuses our nature in a way that is co-natural. So it's not supernatural, it doesn't violate our nature, but it fulfills our nature. It makes our nature better than it is without the infusion. So, I mean, it is sort of a, quirky is not the right word, but it is sort of a very strange thing to think about, that this thing that is external to us, because it's external and it's infused to us, then it nevertheless is not in violation of our nature, but in actuality fulfills our nature. So it is a little bit of a paradoxical, difficult thought to get one's head around. But these faith, hope, and love are the infused virtues. And like the other virtues, we can grow in these. We can acquire them, though they are always a gift. Right? The natural virtues are not directly a gift in the same way that the natural virtues, the co-natural virtues are, the theological virtues. These are directly a gift to us, and so if we have been given the gift of faith because of love, then we have faith. If we have faith, then we have been given the gift of hope. As faith yields or creates hope, and hope creates love, but love supersedes all of the other virtues and is what originates faith in the first place. But the more that we do and practice and spend time with the things that create in us or further us in those virtues, the more entrenched they become in us. And so, like justice, in any given situation, I can know what the just thing to do is. I can know what the loving thing to do is, the charitable act toward my neighbors. So I don't want to belabor Thomas too long, because it largely echoes, as I said, it's largely an appropriation, and the real interesting sort of original work is the theological virtues. So some of you may remember reading Power of Failure, Albert Boardman's book, and hearing Dr. Waters talk about focal things and focal practice. And generally a focal thing is concrete and of commanding presence. And a focal practice is the decided, regular, and normally communal devotion to a focal thing. So do some of you remember, or one of you remember, any of you remember, what are two of the contrasts? Right, so let's think a little bit about the background of Boardman. So Power of Failure is about the device paradigm, right? Yes, broadly, I see some assent. So the device paradigm and the focal things, and what is it about the device paradigm? What does he say about the device paradigm? Or what is a device?
Well, it's not a neutral entity. It has an agenda.
Okay. It has an agenda.
It's infused with a purpose.
What else? Other things that we remember? So one of the things that we can do with devices that we can't do with focal things is turn them off, right? So a device, I can turn off my computer, I can turn off my cell phone, I can turn off lots of other things. In the particular chapter where he begins the discussion and introduces the idea of focal thing and focal practices, the juxtaposition he uses is a radio and a musical instrument / musician. So the radio for him is not a focal thing. It's a device. I can turn on the radio at my whim with the advent of frequency, now satellite radio. I can flip the dials to whatever music I fancy. I can listen to country and feel nostalgic about my time in Iowa in the mid-90s, which I often do. I can then turn it off when I want to listen to something else while I clean and wash the dishes. I'm in a particularly upbeat mood, or I want to go to the gym, so I flip on a different radio station and listen to something a little bit more beat, something a little bit more driven, to get the sort of, right, we saw from Plato that these things affect us and affect our states and affect our passions and emotions. So in this case, I'm using the device paradigm to access music to facilitate my multiple experiences. By contrast, the musical instrument that sits in the corner that I don't have and I can't play, bless you, but the musical instrument, the guitar, by contrast, is a focal thing. The guitar is a focal thing in contrast because it has a commanding presence. Why does it have a commanding presence? Because it will just sit there and do nothing if someone doesn't pick it up.
Well, if someone doesn't pick it up, but typically, by virtue of its being there, it's already been kind of selected. I mean, and often, in many cases, I mean, if you go into someone's house and there's a guitar there, typically it's because they've purchased it or it's been gifted to them, and so there is a certain amount of significance.
Potentially, but that's not that certainly wouldn't distinguish it from a stereo, right? I mean, there are stereos that have been purchased, there are stereos that have been given,
right, but
there are stereos that are much larger and physical space.
It takes a different kind of investment, though, I think.
I mean, I don't know.
As a guitarist, I mean, I think I'm...
Well, right, but you're speaking from as someone who plays a guitar.
Right, so, I mean, maybe
right, so
for someone who plays guitar, maybe it's more of a focal thing, whereas for someone who doesn't have an investment in playing it or in listening to it even, then it may be more of a device. Maybe.
Well, it's not a device because device is something that I can use. And I can't use a guitar if I can't play it.
Isn't there a notion of skill involved with the focal things, whereas the device requires less skill and anybody could use it? So, as per your example, the radio is a device because it doesn't require that many skills. You can turn it on, turn it off. Whereas a musical instrument, you have to, I mean, you can make noise on it, but in order to use it to its fullest extent, you have to practice it, you have to learn it, you have to do it.
Same thing with the radio. Like you have to know what does what on the radio.
But not to the same extent, though.
Right, but
I mean, with the radio, you have to learn how to turn it on and then tuning
Right.
and volume, and that's really basics. It doesn't take as long to learn as it would.
But it does take learning.
A little bit.
One does have to learn, and that's not necessarily what's going to distinguish them.
Okay.
I mean, and we'll see in a subsequent or as a contemporary author's definition of practice that is broadly Aristotelian. Borgman is not really, I mean, I wouldn't classify him as Aristotelian by any stretch. I don't really know where he fits broadly. But you'll see some of those concepts kind of come together. And that's really what we're after, because we spent time with Borgman. I wanted to bring him in because I think he is right about a focal thing and focal practices, right? They are something that require us to attend to them, right? The radio or the stereo doesn't require the same sort of attention that does, and in order for it to produce music, his example is, like, I can own a stereo. I can't own Michael playing the guitar in my apartment. At least not.
Ethically.
Right. I mean, at least it's against the law still.
Well, I guess the other notion Borgman has is for device, there's the concealment of the means.
The concealment of the means.
Right. So how the music comes about, we don't need to know. And
Right.
it just plays for us. So it's more
Right.
like a commodity.
Right.
And that's, I mean, we have to know how to turn it on, but
Right.
it's really, how the, the music comes out, it's,
Right.
we don't care.
Right. The music
I guess,
is,
yeah, right.
is the music is separate from the creation of the music.
Right.
At a given time and place, it becomes separate and run by Jeff.
I just wonder how rigid the categories are. And
For which?
for focal thing and device, I wonder if it isn't somewhat context specific, because I can imagine a technology becoming, just in the evolution of a kind of technology, an older technology in some ways having more of a commanding presence by virtue of being obsolete.
Say more.
Well, it seems like part of what we talk about in a device is the ease with which we can manipulate. And if that becomes harder and harder as we move further and further away from the thing, like I can think of things now that we sort of think of as old and obsolete but are sort of reappropriated in creative ways.
Such as?
I'm trying to think, I mean, there was a time when like record players were the only way to play music.
Right.
And I feel like they've actually kind of been reappropriated in a very intentional way. There's a kind of commanding presence kind of quality to the ritual of pulling out a record and just the difficulty involved in playing it that, your iPod is just never going to oppose.
Right.
So I just wonder if there's a little bit of a continuum going on.
Right. I mean, I think I'm not as big a fan of Workman as is Dr. Waters. I was introduced to him through Dr. Waters' courses. Right, and he does couch it with generally, right, and normally, right. So there are some clues that there may be some fudge factor. There may be some space to understand things more broadly or slightly differently. Right, because one of the things that he talks about, and I think really when you start talking about the things that he calls focal things, are partially very different from devices, right? I mean, music and I think music and the musical instrument serve a very good heuristic tool for him, and it is partially about that commodification. Being on a whim, whereas the musical instrument, I have to engage, I have to physically do something beyond just like turning the power button on, and maybe changing the radio station, right? So it does involve a lot more. It is a more commanding presence, but even then, when he goes on to talk about what kinds of things are focal things, he talks about the word, the table, the hearth becomes a significant feature for him. And I think what's significant in all of those things is that, yes, the dining room table, if you think of like a classic old house, or if you go back to the remains of the day, and you think of the English butler, the table were these massive tables that people would sit around and eat. And the hearth was the gathering place, right, where instead of having 3 or 4 individuals each focused solely on one TV screen, the hearth was sort of, it was a gathering place that he talks about. And so what really I think is driving him is that it forces us into interaction with other people, right? And if you think of the focal practice, right, so the thing is that which we're practicing around is the decided, regular, normally communal devotion to a focal thing. So we go to the hearth, set the fire in the fireplace in the winter months, and we sit down and we play some cards. Maybe we have, a finger or two of scotch, or whatever the drink of choice is, some old wine, some stew. Maybe we eat there because that really is the only place in warmth. Our food might have been cooked over it. We have a much different. We're forced to interact with that thing, but also with the people around it. And I think there's a communitarian bent in his work, and so I think it's really. The focal things are really those things that sort of push us into, or that push us into interaction with other people. And I think that's really where he's moving. Now I might be wrong about that, but my read of him is that that's sort of what's underlying it, right? And it's that sort of concern for that communal ritual, right? Then he talks about communities of celebration. And so I think it's really more about that communal aspect than it is a precise definition of a focal thing, is this and it's not this. Because he doesn't really go through a whole lot of lists of like, it is this, it's not this, it is this, it's not this. He just says these are some focal things. And they all sort of are more about engagement with other people, and the thing is really just kind of, we have to eat and we have to keep warm. And it's good that we celebrate. So, I mean, that's kind of my take. But think about these two things as we move through and as we get to the conclusion with the remains of the day, because the focal thing and the focal practice is going to be significant. And now, the arguably most well-known definition of practice in a neo-Aristotelian concept is Alistair McIntyre and after virtue. And it's by practice I'm going to mean any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, with the result that the human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. Is it clear? Right? So, the words in red, I'm just curious, is that easy to read?
I can't.
Not at all? Well, that doesn't work at all then. Oh yeah. Let's see if we can do that. Is that better? How's that? That's that way you all can see. So the words in red are sort of the key concepts. And so practice, that's sort of the overarching concept. Now practice for McIntyre is largely akin to the process of habituation for Aristotle, or the habits of Aristotle, the creation of crafts, of the saddles, etc., etc. Now, what constitutes a practice? It's got to be coherent and complex and socially established, and it has to be a human activity. So it is something that exists between humans. It's cooperative, coherent, and complex. So some things that are examples for him that are practices. Usually his examples break down into a couple of categories. One is games, and the other is sort of building. And so he'll say that chess is an example of a practice. Tic-tac-toe is not. The architecture is a practice. He suggested bricklaying is not. The gardening or the planting of tulips is not a practice, but farming is a practice. And so we can begin to see throwing a football is not a practice, but the game of football is a practice. So there has to be some coherence. There has to be some sort of, and coherence for him is rationality, and it's rationality sort of internal to the practice itself, or to the thing itself. So there's a reason why you would play football, or there's a reason why you would build buildings, and there's reasons why you do elements within it. There are things that, right, like you draw plans, you do these things, and so this is coherent. That you don't draw a plan for building X and then show up on the job site and produce something totally different. So it's coherent and it's complex. So there has to be a certain amount of complexity to it. And partially that's just the way, I think, that's just the way practices are by necessity. Tic-tac-toe doesn't require a large amount of skill compared to the game of chess, right? There's like 3 or 4 moves in tic-tac-toe, and that's about it. In contrast to chess, there are multiple pieces. They each move in their own way. There are opening moves, counter moves. It's a game that I will never master. But because of that, there are goods lost to me because I will never master chess. Right? There are internal goods to each practice that one can only acquire or know if one is a practitioner of chess. So Michael knows certain things about guitars and guitar playing that I can never know. Right? Some people would distinguish that between the know-how and know that. Right? So I can know that a guitar makes this sound, but I don't know how the guitar makes that sound, and I don't know how to produce that sound on the guitar. So partially, though, there are standards of excellence, and those standards of excellence partially define what it means to play the guitar well or to play chess well, but they also extend it. So, for example, the game of chess. There are rules to the game. The knight only moves in certain ways. The bishop only moves in certain ways. The rook moves in certain ways. The pawn, so too. So we have these rules, and without those rules, it's not the game of chess, right? It's something else. Or worse, it's a board with some figurines on it, and it's a knick-knack. But with those rules, and with attention to those rules, playing chess can emerge. And so it's appropriate to, right? It's appropriate to chess to move the knight in a certain direction, but it's also partially definitive of chess that the knight moves in that direction. So, excuse me. So that with the result that human powers to achieve excellent human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. So what are some of the internal goods of chess? Well, there's a certain analytic skill involved, right? I have to be able to analyze what my opponent is doing so that I can then counter his or her moves and hopefully win, right? Because the goal of the game is to win. The goal of the game is not to end in a stalemate. The goal is a checkmate. And so as people advance and move up through being able to analyze and understand the game and how the pieces move and what potential counter moves are, and be able to think ahead and find, and if I move here, the person I'm playing may move here, or they may do this, and if they do that, then these are my options. So it's the ability to think ahead of the game and ahead of the potential consequences of my move at this point that really begins to nurture and habituate a analytic skill that is unique to the game of chess. And internal goods are that way, right? I can only know what it is to play football by playing the game of football. There are certain things that are lost to me as a mere observer. So then we might wonder, well, how is it that practices are acquired? Or how are those internal goods are acquired? And why goods internal? Because McIntyre will distinguish between goods internal and goods external to a practice. And so, for example, his story about how chess is acquired in a child is exemplary of the tension between internal goods and external goods. So I want to teach this child chess, but this child doesn't really have any interest in chess. However, the child has keen interest in Tootsie Rolls. So I promised the child, if you play chess with me for an hour, I'll give you a Tootsie Roll. So now I come, and once a week we get together, we play chess, the child gets a Tootsie Roll. Over time, the child is getting better at chess because he keeps playing for this Tootsie Roll. The hope is that the child will eventually come to want to play chess because they have come to appreciate the game of chess, and the external good of the Tootsie Roll is merely ancillary, right? So the hope would be that I can take away the external good of the Tootsie Roll, and the child will want to come back and play chess because the child has grown to appreciate and become good at the game of chess. and in so doing, acquires some of the internal goods of the game, namely a certain kind of analytic skill. Now, if the child does not want that, but instead would rather have the Tootsie Roll, so the game is not important to the child, but the external reward is, and now I've predicated it upon the child winning because the child has advanced and improved, that this child will get 2 pieces of Tootsie Roll if he or she wins. So now the child has an incentive to win because of his really keen interest in Tootsie Rolls, and he or she is now going to get 2. So if the child then chooses to violate the rules of chess by cheating, say I walk out of the room and he or she moves the pieces around and makes it impossible for me to win, and virtually guarantee that he or she will win, has violated the standards of excellence of chess, right? And he's gone after the external goods, and the practice becomes a means to that other end. And as a consequence of that, the analytic skills of chess are lost to that child. So the goal is to become habituated in such a way toward a practice that one relishes in the practice. Well, there are virtues embedded in acquiring a practice, right? So initially I can induce the small child, but what if the inducement is something else? Or what if it's something that I just want to learn because I think it's interesting? So the 3 virtues that McIntyre posits are necessary are courage, honesty, and justice. And so why are courage, honesty, and justice necessary? Well, courage, because oftentimes it's pretty doggone humiliating, frustrating to submit oneself to those folks who know how to play the game of chess, right? So I need to go to those persons and say, I really want to learn the game of chess, and I know that means I'm not going to be very good at it because I don't know anything about it. And so the ability to be in a state that says, I'm going to risk myself in order to acquire this skill. And honesty, because I have to admit that I'm not good and that there are other people better than me at this thing. And justice, because I have to recognize to whom what is due. And so, again, we see the ancient concept of desert that we saw in George Grant's work, the concept of desert. So I need to know that a certain amount of respect is due to the chess master, and that this person can likely teach me to play chess better than my neighbor who's been playing for a month. Right? So there's a certain amount of justice embedded in the appropriation of and extension of practices. As one of the critiques that many people place upon McIntyre is that, right, there is these standards of excellence and there are authority and there's the power dynamic at play, and he doesn't offer any corrective or really any awareness of that. And I think his counter is consistently that you've misunderstood how important the virtues are in extending them, and that if justice and honesty and courage are in place, then you are drawing upon the person bound who has acquired the skills is also bound by or has acquired the virtue and the habits of justice, and so they know then what is due the person who is now learning. So it is not as if power and is unchecked or standards of excellence are arbitrary, but they are embedded in a way that oftentimes folks are not readily able to pick up. Questions so far?
I was just thinking about that
Well, now we have neuroscience, and this obviously moves us past Aristotle, but does predicate us on our natural biology. So I'm going to zoom in real quick. So this is the picture underneath the Pavlovian system, and what you see are size of brains, and the red part is the prefrontal or the frontal cortex, which is where advanced level processing happens. This is our goal processing. So you can see in the human, the chimpanzee, the cat, the dog, the squirrel monkey, and the rhesus monkey very different sizes of brain, but also different size and percentage of the frontal lobe. And so where this higher complexity, and so the Pavlov system is the base system. If you remember Pavlov's you remember Pavlov, he had the dogs ring the bell, they got fed, eventually they'd ring the bell and they would start salivating because it was this automatic response that they had. The goal system takes place in this part. That red part on the other slide is this part here. So the prefrontal cortex, the big part of the human brain that we have that is significantly bigger than bigger than every other animal, is what allows us to have this goal-directed behavior in very gross, broad scale. I could spend an entire lecture just on this. But in very broad scale, this is what separates us from the animals. It's this very large prefrontal cortex that allows us to think and direct goal-oriented behavior. And so then, well, what does this have to do with habits? Well, what does this have to do with habit formation? So over the last 20 years, neuroscience has examined the way the brain learns. Stephen Court suggests that the single most important finding of neuroscience over the last 20 years has been the critical and central role of the habit system in all of our behavior. He argues that habits and habit systems comprise an essential middle role between two competing behavior systems in the brain. So we have the Pavlovian, which is one, the goal system, which is the other. The Pavlovian system operates at the neurological level, that instinctual system, right? Bell rings, I always get food, I hear the bell ring, my instinct kicks in, I start salivating. So, and this is hardwired. Now, hardwired is malleable, we understand that now. But the Pavlovian system at its base level is a hardwired response. And it operates without much engagement with the prefrontal cortex. So I don't really need much of that big area of human beings to respond to that, right? So I am thirsty. Neuroscience suggests now that we respond to our feeling of thirst after we've already moved to satiate that thirst. So we are actually thirsty. Our biological response is fired before we have the mental thought that I'm thirsty. So in that system, our motor systems fire without our conscious effort and often against our own interests. So by contrast, the goal system operates within the prefrontal cortex. This system pulls on the other system, but it does so in attention-filled and purposeful ways. These two systems have strengths, but also significant weaknesses. The former responds rapidly, but does not process with enough flexibility to be of use in these situations. Right? So I hear a different bell ring, I don't know that I need to go get food, because it's not the same bell. And that's where the rigidity and the lack of flexibility exists as problematic for the Pavlovian system. Now the latter, so the goal system possesses great flexibility, but that flexibility costs speed and becomes too computationally expensive. A brain that learns habits and possesses a habit system can occupy a middle ground between these two systems. So if I'm always in a new situation, and I always have to come up with a new response that I can't draw on anything in the past, that takes a long time. It takes a really long time to move from one activity to the next because I don't know, I don't have any, it's always new information. So the habit system operates in this middle space. It begins with the hardwiring, but it allows the reward center in the brain to rewire the brain to accommodate new information. Quartz uses the example of a bee programmed to land on yellow flowers to receive nectar. If scarcity did not exist, then the Pavlovian system would work without much error. So the bee lands on a flower, perpetually lands on a yellow flower. Every time it lands on a yellow flower, it gets the nectar, the little dopamine receptor, and the goal reward system goes off, everything's good. Well, the nectar in that flower is a scarce resource, so any time the bee lands on that flower, there's no nectar. Dopamine system's like, what's going on? I expected a reward. There's no reward. So bee picks up, lands, happens to land on a purple flower. Lands on a purple flower, boom. Oh, there's nectar. Dopamine response, goal learned. Bee now knows that it can land on yellow or purple flowers and get nectar. So its learning has expanded because of scarcity, but we also learn more when we make mistakes or when the reward system is not lit up immediately and we have to find new information and then the reward system lights up. So neuroscientists label this learning a habit because the bee has associated the purple flower with the reward of nectar. The bee uses a single brain cell to build this regularity of behaviors, whereas humans obviously were using much more than a single cell, but the basic structure exists across species, and it varies in the neurochemical composition as well as the complexity of the wiring. But essentially, the structure is identical, or in its essential function, it's identical. The human brain comprises the most complex forms of that basic structure. And we know that we can also learn from other folks. And so mirror neurons have a role in all of this, which is why stories are particularly powerful, which is why music is particularly powerful, and which is why those focal things are particularly important for Borgman, because it's these areas of convergence that we begin to see this role that habit plays and that can orienting us toward the good has a significant role both in biological functioning, but then also in where we end up in our moral decision making. So, to fast forward to the remains of the day, right, one of the key questions is what makes a good butler? And then the other is it possible to be both a good butler and a good man? And if you think through the narrative of the story, it begins with him reminiscing about some of his interactions with other colleagues and the decline of butlering. And he talks about the Hayes Society, which asks the question, what does it mean to be a good butler? You know, what does it mean to be promoted in this society and to be included as a butler of high rank? And so one of the standards they suggest, right, and this is a standard of excellence, right, we began to see some of those loops back and forth when we come back in. And so one of the things that makes for a good butler is that they're attached to a prestigious house, right? So they are employed in a house of high rank, right? This is again another world from where most of us live in contemporary U.S. culture and contemporary Western culture. But so that's one condition. And the other condition, and our butler is not convinced that that's really in keeping with contemporary times. Like, there was a disdain for the nouveau riche, there was a disdain for business people. It really had to be one of these old aristocratic families that constituted a good house, a nice house. So, what makes a good butler? The other consideration that he entertains is this notion that dignity in keeping the office. And he says, well, what does that mean? And so there's a debate then between Mr. Graham and himself. And the debate goes something like, well, dignity... What's wrong? Oh.
The computer.
What about it?
Was he still connected?
Oh yeah, he's still connected. He's I'd say.
Oh, he has a baby.
Yeah, he's still connected.
I just saw this little thing going like that. So
Yeah, it's not a dancing icon, it's a dancing baby.
Now we've got Ally McBeal.
Right. So, that's all right. So, dignity in keeping his office. So then he says, in the debate that ensues, and remember they're sitting around a hearth after a day's service, debating these conversations with other butlers. And so you have this community of practice and practitioners sitting around talking with one another. And it's in this conversation that one suggests the dignity in keeping one's office is just you either have it or you don't. It's like being an ugly woman or not, right? You're either ugly or you're not. And this is a position that our butler cannot stomach. He says, no, it can't be that way. This is certainly an acquired thing. One can acquire dignity in keeping with the office. But I agree that it is this, like, what exactly is it? And so he tells a couple stories, right? So the first story is 2 stories about his dad, who, by all accounts, embodies the ideal butler. He is the butler par excellence. This is the model that other butlers ought to strive to become like. And the one story that he tells is when his employer was having a guest to the house who had been intimately involved with execution of the war and had killed his son. And he said he treated this guest in his employer's home without any difference, and in fact his treatment was so excellent to this person that upon his departure the butler was given a rather large tip, and the tip was then turned over to the employer and asked to be donated to charity. The second story that he suggests shows dignity in keeping with the office is his father is driving several gentlemen who are staying with his employer, and they've had a little bit too much to drink, and they are bad-mouthing some folks and bad-mouthing one another. And at one point, one of the gentlemen says, maybe we should knock this off. It's not really good behavior. And they keep right on coming, and the conversation keeps going, and then they turn to his father's employer. And when salacious attack the father, he stops the car abruptly, or the father's employer rather, he stops the car abruptly, opens the car door, stands in there, and urges them to get out without losing his cool. Apparently he had a rather intimidating presence, and the gentlemen are quiet the rest of the way. So in both of those, he's suggesting that this is dignity in keeping with the office. And so what makes a good butler is someone who protects the interest of his employer, even to the point of defacing his own interests in the nature and discharge of their office. And we fast forward to the question, is it possible to be both a good butler and a good man? And when he's reflecting on his former employer, who had, if you recall, courted the Nazis and was trying to be a player, if you will, in international affairs, and was misguided, which is what the realization is at the end of the book. And it's a particularly poignant statement where he says, Lord Darlington wasn't a bad man. He wasn't a bad man at all. And at least he had the privilege of being able to say at the end of his life that he made his own mistakes. His life would prove to be a misguided one, but there, he chose it. He can say that at least. As for myself, I cannot even claim that. You see, I trusted in his lordship's wisdom. All those years I served him, I trusted I was doing something worthwhile. I can't even say I made my own mistakes, really. One has to ask oneself, what dignity is there in that? And so it is at the end of the book that he comes to wonder about the question, is it possible to be a good butler and a good human? And I think the conclusion that he comes to is no. And the conclusion is no because it requires, in order to be a good human, to make one's own choices. And a butler is prohibited from making one's own choices. Right? The butler serves his lordship. Or his employer. Yeah, go ahead.
Or is it that the goodness would be accidental? Like if his lordship, was thoroughly good man, then the butler's goodness would be sort of, incidental to his, employer's goodness.
Well, the question hinges on, was he a bad man? And he says, no, he wasn't a bad man, he was misguided.
Right.
But his misguidance was based on his own choices.
Right.
Right, and the butler doesn't have that choice.
Right.
Right, the butler serves his lordship. And so I think what he's driving at, and what the author is driving at, is that there is, what Ishiguro is driving at, is that there is a necessary component of autonomy in order to be good. And in order to be bad, right? You certainly don't ascribe moral culpability to someone if they lack the full information.
So what we're really talking about as far as being good is moral agency.
That is a constitutive element of being good.
So whether or not his employer who is serving is a good man or a bad man is really not the issue. It's whether he has moral agency or not. Whether the butler does.
I think that's partially right.